Hello, everyone. My name is Ann Moseley. I am the director and curator for the Sangamon Experience here at UIS, and I'm joining you today here on the campus of the University of Illinois at Springfield to share another wonderful program highlighting Family History Month. We are actually going to be joined later by Anna, who will be speaking a little bit about the research she's been doing here at UIS regarding family histories as well as local. So we look forward to having her on the program today. A few housekeeping comments before we get started with our programming. If you have a question for either presenters, so myself or Anna this morning, feel free to write them in the comments and we'll be sure to get to your questions after the program. Also, let us know where you're tuning in from. Are you here in Illinois or are you tuning in from somewhere across the United States or the globe? Feel free to let us know. The program today will be highlighting people, places, and events. Oh my. The reason why we called the program that specific title is because we are focusing on Family History Month, which is the month of October. And with that, we are showcasing the connection that our family stories have with local history. Central Illinois holds a vast and unique resources for genealogy and local history, such as the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, as we learned in last month's program. And we also have a number of resources at our public library here in town that allow you to use databases and other resource materials, including the Sangamon Valley collection that you can find here at our public library. But not all materials are available online, of course. And with COVID, we've learned to do a lot of our research digitally and through databases and different organizations that have offered some digital materials for us. But sometimes we have to go in person to do research at libraries, museums, and archives. This program will hopefully provide some insight in how you can do some of the family research from the comfort of your own home, but also how to make those connections with our libraries and institutions and hear a little bit on how your family research or family research in general can connect us to the communities that surround us. So as we get started, I'm going to actually introduce Anna first. So here is Miss Anna, and I'm going to try to pronounce your last name, Anna. Is it Kanai?
It's actually Kanai.
Kanai, okay. Anna, you're a student here at UIS. Mm-hmm. And can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a graduate student right now. I'm studying communication, but my undergrad programs were political science and global studies. So I don't really have a big history background, but I love history. And my family, actually, it's funny that you mentioned my last name. My family, especially my grandpa, has been very interested in like ancestry and some of that stuff as well, trying to figure out the origins of our last name. It's still kind of a big mystery. But I do love history, and so I was able to do a little background work on one of Abraham Lincoln's neighbors. So I get to talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah. Wonderful. Yeah, she's been doing a lot of really great research here on campus, and it's been a lot of fun working with her because as we dive in, I think her program today is going to be a little bit more exciting than mine because the stories that she has been able to uncover have been very, very interesting, and a few rabbit holes that I wish I was able to find. So I'm still doing some digging, but what are some of the resources that you've been able to use within your research?
Yeah, so mainly I focus on Ancestry.com. I was able to get a subscription or whatever it's called. And then I also just did a lot of searching like old newspapers online and some of the digital archives and some of the also like Library of Congress stuff too. So yeah, it's been fun. I love like going through and trying to figure out the old, cursive handwriting and some of the old English. But I really have enjoyed it. And yes, it definitely took me through some rabbit holes. So hopefully I can organize it fairly well so everyone can understand.
Well, Anna, I'm going to kick us off so then you'll be able to also see how some of our paths will cross. Folks, as we go through both of our programs, you'll find there's a lot of overlap because we focused on the Lincoln neighborhood because there's a lot of research already done there, but we wanted to focus on the individuals versus Lincoln himself. And so we were looking at the people who surround the community. And one of the biggest helpmates for us was Dick Hart, a local historian here in town who has already done a lot of research on the Lincoln neighborhood, but gave us some starting points on who would be very interesting to look into, but also it led us to areas that showcase a lot of the diversity within the neighborhood itself. So Anna, I'm going to let you go backstage for a little bit and tune in, and I'll get started. All right. So for those who've been following our Center for Lincoln Studies page, as well as our Sangamon Experience Facebook pages, probably know that I've been working on a book called A Maid of All Work, the women who worked for the Lincolns. And I gave this program for the Highland Games, so for the St. Andrews Society here in town. And what I was able to find in the midst of all this was some of the rich stories behind the maids. And I'm not going to go into greater detail about this because I want you to continue to ask questions about some of these maids. But I am going to talk about some of the ways that I was able to discover more about their families. So if you'll pay close attention, you'll get a chance to see some of the very interesting women and their life stories and how they were able to come here to Illinois. So I want to kick off a little bit with our first kicking point, which is when you look at the history of Illinois and you look at the middle class, you get a variety of different people. So in Springfield, Illinois, there were people from all over, and the population in 1860 consisted of a little over 3,000 individuals. And you can find a lot of this census information either on Ancestry, but you also have the Census Bureau, who does a lot of posting on their website showcasing the populations of cities, counties, and even the state of Illinois has collected it. So in Illinois, specifically here in Springfield, you have a large population of Irish immigrants and German. And you start to see, too, a large population of Portuguese, which came a little earlier. And most of the people who were moving to central Illinois that were Irish were looking for good farmland. And they were moving out to the Midwest to kind of start a brand new life for themselves. Some of the big names here in central Illinois connected to the Irish, you can find within census records, but also just in the early settlers of Sangamon County by John Carroll Powers. He talks quite a bit about the Irish farmers that came out here. You also have a large grouping of individuals who were focused on cattle. There are some pretty interesting local history books about cattlemen here in central Illinois. But the Irish were mostly these lower to middle class individuals, depending on what time period they showed up in. So if it was during the potato famine in the late 1830s, 1840s, you have individuals who have no money, who are moving out here without having a lot of things to their name. And so they are starting at kind of the lower occupations that don't pay very well. And this included domestic servants. You have indentured servitude at this time. So you have a lot of individuals coming and they're working off their debt. A lot of them paid with basically all the money that they had to actually come to the Midwest. And so they had no money and no prospects. So what they would do is they would look for families that needed help. One of the families that did need help were the Lincolns. Now, in doing some of the research on the Irish, and as you can probably tell, I'm going to be talking about the Irish domestics the most today. So what I was able to find in the newspapers, just like Anna, was I was able to focus quite a bit on where people were putting advertisements to try to find these Irish domestics to come into their home. So most of the time here in Springfield, when you went to hire a domestic, you would put an advertisement in the newspaper. And there were two newspapers here in Springfield. You had the State Journal and you had the State Register. And this is where you would put your advertisements for a new individual to come work in your home. But it also was newspapers were a way for people to voice their opinion about different immigrant groups that would come in to the town. And sometimes when you started to get an overpopulation of immigrants, you start to see kind of some negative feeling, but also you get the hype of the cultural phenomenons around certain groups. So the first newspaper article I have here is "Today is the festival known as St. Patrick's Day." And this is from the March 17th, 1854, Friday edition of the Daily Illinois State Journal. In that article, you continue to read on. We see the RCB Society out in their gala, dressed in procession, marching to the music of the Temperance Band, which does indeed discourse excellent music. This evening, the society dine at the Planters Hotel, whereof probably we shall have more to say hereafter. So basically what they're saying is that the Irish in Springfield, Illinois are celebrating St. Patrick's Day, and they are trying to get people excited about it and letting them know about the organization that is putting together the festivities, highlighting everything Irish. You also have in the 1860 advertisement in the State Register talking about the Catholic Institute and how Irish citizens conduct themselves, and how they're able to be these middle class, higher up individuals who are able to celebrate St. Patrick's Day and honor it. And these are individuals full of faith, especially Catholic faith, and they discuss, who will be there and where it's at, and gets people excited. So the population of Springfield, just to kind of give you an idea of the growth of the immigrant population in Springfield, you see in 1850, the population was a little over 4,000 individuals. The total population of individuals living in Springfield that were born in Ireland were 255. So there was a large population of Irish individuals here. But as you see in 1860, that population of Irish-born citizens grows quite a bit. the population's a little over 9,000 in Springfield, and the Irish-born population is over 1,000. Now, how does this connect to our families? How does this connect to our genealogy? These are just articles about St. Patrick's Day and how it's celebrated. Well, if you do have an Irish connection within your family tree and those ancestors lived here in Springfield, Illinois, they would have seen these articles and they would have been a part of a group of individuals who were seeking work, who were trying to build a life here. And you get a chance to see what their culture had impact on here in Springfield. And really in central Illinois, because you didn't just get the Springfield paper if you lived here in Springfield. You got it if you lived in Sangamon County, or if you wanted to find out more. So as we will see, the Irish population here grew quite a bit. And you also get to see a middle class society forming here in central Illinois, which leads me to what the middle class thought about the Irish groups of immigrants that were settling here. Now, here I have a song from the Library of Congress that was written during the 1850s, and it was called "No Irish Need Apply." Now, I bring this up because there were a lot of high society women within Springfield that included Mrs. Lincoln, who were a part of this rising middle class of individuals who disliked the Irish. They felt they were wild, they were uncivilized. They would complain about their Irish domestics not dressing appropriately. And what's interesting is, even though they didn't like them, they were the only hard workers that were available at this time. I don't have images of the maids who worked for the Lincolns, mostly because they didn't have money to buy photographs of themselves. But here's a drawing of what an Irish domestic looked like. And they were hard workers. A lot of them had to do additional work. And so when you went to kind of see what a typical maid did in a house, you wouldn't just have a maid just for cooking and then another for house cleaning. It wasn't like Downton Abbey. A lot of times they were a maid of all work. So they cleaned, they took care of children, they also cooked, they prepared for festivities in the home, and they were fulfilling a role that most of us see when we sign contracts for a new job, which is that additional line that says, "and other duties assigned." Well, these maids did it all. That was pretty much their job description. So the reason why I feel like this song is very important to look at is because if you're looking at your ancestors in the 1850s and they journeyed over here, they were met with a lot of resistance. A lot of times there would be signs in shop windows for certain positions, basically telling them, "You're not needed here. We want someone else, and we feel like you would not be a good fit." So a lot of times it was very hard for them to find positions. So what did a maid do? Well, they did general housework, they lit fires, they cleaned rooms, cooked and waited tables, they sewed, they looked after children, and they were constantly on call, even until the evening. Most of these women did not have an 8-hour day. They were paid very poorly, and they were on call all the time. Most of the time, if they had a kind individual who was hiring them, they would get Sundays off. So you had that. You had your Sunday off. Now, I bring up the Lincolns only because they are an example of a middle-class family. Later on, as Lincoln becomes a more influential lawyer, he serves as a representative for 4 terms. He marries a woman who's used to having slaves in the house when she lived in Kentucky, and servants when she lived with her sister in Springfield. And when they were able to earn more money, they were able to hire a maid. And in July of 1848, while Mr. Lincoln is serving as a congressman, he notices that Mrs. Lincoln is having a very difficult time holding a maid in her house. So he writes to her from Congress stating, quote, "You do not intend to do without a girl. Get another as soon as you can." So Mrs. Lincoln went through a lot of maids, and I'm going to mention a few of them, but not a whole lot, because if I did, this would be a very long program, because she went through maids pretty much every few years, and it was very difficult for her to maintain her household. So what did Springfield look like during the time the maids worked for the Lincolns? Well, I already showcased some of the different immigrant groups that came in and out of Springfield. And what I'm going to be showing you here is the Globe Tavern. This is the first home that the Lincolns had. This is where Robert Lincoln was born. And this is where Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln started their lives together. Now, a tavern is where you didn't just go to have a drink, but it was a place where you got a ride to go to a next destination. Some people stayed the night there. Some people lived there, just like the Lincolns. And there were a lot of coming and goings within this building, but it was close enough to downtown as well, so you would be able to walk to and from. As you can see in this picture, people who were living in Springfield, you didn't have very good sidewalks. Buildings were quite smaller and spaced out. If you go downtown to Springfield today, it's jam-packed with more buildings. And you also had signage on walls, on fence posts, and this would be a typical scene that you would see within the Springfield area. Now, they had 4 boys. So if you're looking at a domestic worker in the Lincoln home, they would have 4 boys to look after. Now, for those of you who either teach school or are familiar with taking care of children, 4 boys is a handful. And this would be a responsibility for the maid to help Mrs. Lincoln care and run after all of these boys. Just thinking about it just makes me exhausted. The home itself was 1 story from 1844 to 1856. The maid would have a very small room, the size of almost a closet. She would have her bed. She would have a dresser that maybe had 3 drawers in it. She didn't have the large rooms that we have today. There were some maids who didn't even have a place to sleep in the home. They had to find lodgings elsewhere. But the first maid that stayed at the Lincoln home would have been in this smaller building. Now, what happened in the Lincoln home when it was this size, and what was the financial constraints of the household? We can find a lot of this within the financial records. Luckily, with Mr. Lincoln, we were able to find books that were written about the financial aspects of Mr. Lincoln and his family. There was a lot of record keeping going on throughout Lincoln's life. He balanced a checkbook and ledgers just like the rest of us. Now, in regards to your own family history, if you're going through financial records, a lot of times that will be in personal collections. So this is where you can go and reach out to your grandparents and see what documents that they've had passed down to them over the years. You can also find financial information in letters. A lot of times, if you look at early histories, parents would mail funds to their children, to other family members. So postage becomes very important during this time. Also, you can figure out the finances of a household through looking at newspapers, interesting enough, because you can find the prices of milk and other produce within the newspaper, because a lot of times merchants would have lists within the newspaper column as a part of an ad listing how much things cost as a part of their advertisement. So you can find out a lot of information of just what the cost of living was like during this time. So if you have a family member living in the 1840s, you are able to kind of get a glimpse of what the cost of living was based on newspaper accounts, city directories, advertisements, and a lot of these you can find on digital archives. So, what did a maid come in contact with in living in this home? Well, initially, when the Lincolns bought their home in 1844, they didn't really have a lot of money for a maid. And Lincoln spent most of the money on the house itself. Who was living there? Well, Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln, their littlest son, Robert. By 1844, Lincoln moves up in his career, starts to make a little bit more money because he becomes a senior partner. But with a little bit more money, he's having to pay more into his law offices. And so he's having to also invest in his own business. But you get a first record of their first maid that starts working in their home, and that's Harriet Hanks. Now, Harriet is very interesting because she is actually a relative of Abraham Lincoln. So instead of paying her a wage, he pays for her education. So he pays for her school. And this happens quite a bit. For those who can't hire a maid, they end up taking on a cousin, a niece, a nephew, and they work in the home. When Lincoln is elected to the House of Representatives, he's getting more money. And this is where you start to see some big changes within the Lincoln home. They're able to hire someone, and then Mrs. Lincoln decides to do some remodeling, and she ends up adding a bedroom, a pantry. The kitchen is removed from the back of the house and moved over several feet, and so they're able to add on to their home. Eddie is also born. So during this time, you start to see the Lincoln family grow up and end up expanding, which means Mrs. Lincoln is in need of more help. And then you get another remodel during from 1846 to 1850. This is where Mary Hogan comes in. Now, Mary Hogan is a very fascinating person. She is an Irish domestic. So I spoke earlier about some of the Irish women who worked within the Springfield home and the cultural situation. But as you look at the timeline here, I'm not going to read all of it, but you have 3 Irish women working in the Lincoln home throughout the 1850s. And you also see a tragedy in the Lincoln's life, and you see a joy. So the maids would have seen all of this. So how did I find this out? Well, there was a letter that was presented thanks to a descendant of Mary Hogan, who eventually became Mary Kelly, who ended up writing a letter to the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency, which is now a department under the Illinois Department of Natural Resources, discussing her ancestor and her connection to the Lincolns. Now, what's really neat is if you go to the Sangamon Valley collection, you will find that there are families that lived in Sangamon County that have family records within their collection. And you can find letters, written family histories, as well as newspaper accounts that have been collected over the years. So we may not have the long ancestral lineage and provenance prominence that the Lincoln family had, but there are families within Sangamon County that have a rich history that have been collected over the years. And luckily, Mary Hogan's descendant was able to add to her collection. Also, in looking at the census records, you find that Mary Hogan has her wedding announcement within the newspaper. So it's really neat to see that addition to the newspaper accounts, and you're able to find a lot of information there. Also, if you look in the census records, you will find Catherine Gordon's name listed in the Lincoln household. You can see how old she was. She was 18, and where she was born. So ancestral records, such as the census records that you can find on Ancestry, you're able to find out quite a bit. And this is the room that the maids would have slept in at the Lincoln home. So you get a feel of what an Irish domestic was able to put in her room when she was working at the home. Now, Margaret Brown eventually became a maid for the Lincolns, and she was able to be there during a great change within the Lincoln home, and that is when another story was added. So the first floor home grows, and you start to see a porch, you see a second floor, and Margaret Brown would have recognized this change. Now, Margaret Brown is in the 1855 census. You're able to see her there, but she's not listed by name. She is listed as a number. Now, how do we figure this out? Well, we look at how old she was. We look at her birth record. We look at her death certificate to find more information. But we also have a letter that Mary wrote to Margaret Brown after Mary Lincoln gave her her nightcap. So even family treasures that are in our family collections that we keep on our own can tell us a wider story as well. So this nightcap meant a lot to Margaret because Margaret was quite close to Mrs. Lincoln, and the fact that this was given to her by her employer in honor of her marriage, it was a very kind gesture, and also allowed her to have a story that goes along with it. Now, as I stated earlier, these maids would have seen a great change in the Lincoln home from 1856 to 1860. The most significant change is the second floor. Now, in 1856, Lincoln becomes a nominee, and so now you have women working in the Lincoln home of a person who is of great prominence, and you start to see a development in Lincoln's career. So Mary is being a bit more selective of the maids that she picks to come into her home. Ellen Matthews joins. Now, her story is one of my favorites because she is a maid who works in the home. She's very kind. She speaks very highly of her employer, but she experiences an episode of Mary's that was not very kind, and Ellen is forced to leave her position. What ends up happening is, as I stated earlier, Sunday is a day of rest. So Ellen ends up doing something you're not supposed to do on a Sunday, and that is work. Ellen forgot to roast coffee beans, which was part of her duties on a Saturday morning. What ends up happening, she roasts them on Sunday and gets caught by Mrs. Lincoln. She is chased out of the house with a broom down the street just for roasting coffee beans on a Sunday. Ellen leaves. She moves into a tavern, gets a new job, and does not return. Mr. Lincoln had to hunt her down to give her wages that she earned for working at the home. He even pleaded with her to come back to work, and Ellen refused. The reason why we know this story is because Ellen decided later on, towards the end of her life, to report this to a local newspaper. After Lincoln's death in 1865, a lot of these maids decided to contact newspapers to tell their own Lincoln story, and Ellen was one of those women. You also have Mary Ann Johnson, who becomes a maid for the family, and she joins towards the tail end of the Lincoln's time here in Springfield. You have Julia Conklin, who is another Irish domestic who shows up in the record, who is a maid for the Lincolns. But as you can see here, she is not in the Lincoln home. She has her own residence. We find a lot of maids during this time decided to live on their own. And what's interesting about Julia is her family kept very detailed records and wrote down their family stories and kept them within a journal. And so you're able to read more about her through that. So if you have a family journal, or if you're keeping one currently, make sure you're careful about what you put in it, because eventually your descendants will read it out loud to other family members, and who knows, maybe the public. You have Ellen Matthews, who I mentioned earlier. As you can see here, when she worked for the Lincolns, she was a teenager. She was about 18. And you can see she's listed as a domestic. This is during the time she was finishing her time with the Lincolns and moved on to find a new position. Julia Conklin, while serving as a maid, she ended up moving on her own, stopped being a maid for the Lincolns, and decided to be a companion to Mrs. Lincoln. Now, this was another occupation that women took. They were companions to other women because a lot of times husbands were away from home, and this was a way for women to have someone with them at all times to keep them company, or in Mary's instance, she was quite scared of thunderstorms, and so she would usually have a friend with her whenever the weather would get pretty nasty. Also, Mary had bouts of melancholy and would become quite sad and disconnected, and so having a companion with her allowed her to not fall into the trap of being sad. So once the Lincolns leave, Mary hires a dressmaker by the name of Elizabeth Keckley, who also becomes a close confidant to Mrs. Lincoln when they lived in Washington, D.C. But the story of the maids that lived here in Springfield and worked for the Lincolns gives you an idea of what a life as a domestic looked like, and what the records that are left behind, what story they add to their lives, and how we can better understand women who were here in the Springfield area, and allows us to develop a better understanding. So I'll leave you with this quote. If you have any domestics in your lineage, this is something that I think can really encourage you. The general servant, or maid of all work, is perhaps the only one of her class deserving of commiseration. Her life is a solitary one, and in some places her work is never done. So when you look back at family research and see domestic listed within the census records, know that you have a very hardworking ancestor. And they lived in a town that was growing, thriving, and is a part of a larger national story. And these maids were a part of that, and their story adds more to the collective memory of Central Illinois and the national narrative of Mr. Lincoln and his family. So I hope you were able to learn quite a bit from my particular perspective, but I think that you'll be able to learn so much more from Miss Anna. So I'm going to turn the stage over to her so she can talk to you about the research she has done on one of the Lincoln neighbors.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. That was great. And it's super encouraging too. That was a beautiful, beautiful presentation. Well, I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint real quick and we can get started. All right. So, again, my name is Anna. I'm a student here, but I also work for the Office of Engaged Learning, which a part of that is the Study Aware Office. And so the director, Jonathan Goldberg Bell, asked me a while back to he gave me this name, Peter Berryman, and told me he was one of Abraham Lincoln's neighbors. And basically, I was just supposed to research him. And so it put me on a path where I was really looking at several different aspects and several different people and went down many rabbit holes, but found some pretty cool and exciting things. So yeah, I get to share that with you guys today. So first off, Peter Berryman was born in 1825 in England. And so one of the reasons why this stood out to Jonathan, why Peter did, was because we have a study abroad partner in England and basically really close to where he was born. So we thought it might be kind of cool to partner up with our study abroad, our partner university there, and then also see the connection here because he was born in England, but then moved to Springfield and became a pretty prominent man here. And then he is buried here in the Oak Ridge Cemetery. So basically he worked several different jobs, including some railroad work and things like that. But eventually he did become the superintendent of Springfield's waterworks system. He married Adeline Hutchings, and they lived in Sangamon County, basically for just many years, had 7 children who were all born here. He came to the U.S., though, when he was 22 years old. And so there's not a ton on his wife or on his own personal story. The only thing I could find really on his wife was that she was known as being a charitable and generous hearted woman and a true Christian. So I thought that was kind of cute. But they have 7 children, as I said. But before that, real quick, this is basically the area that they came from in England. And so our partner university is Hull, England. And as you can see, these are just some of the different marks that I made of some of his different ancestors and where they came from. But the majority of them came from Yorkshire. I hope I say that right. And that was just kind of the beginning of all of this. That was the start of the connection because we wanted to look at some of the immigration patterns.
Hey, Anna, can you bring up the map?
Yes. What?
Can you bring up the map that you have?
Oh, this is the map. Can you see it?
I'm only seeing the first slide.
Oh, no. I'm going through the slides. I don't know why you're only seeing one. Oh, no. I'm so sorry.
Oh, you're fine.
Okay. Do you see the next one now?
Nope. Here, let me try to remove it and bring it up again.
Okay, wait. Let me try it from here. Can you see it now? Oh, I'm so sorry.
Oh, you're fine.
Can you see the second one now?
Nope.
Oh, no. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing and then retry.
Okay.
Okay. Here we go again. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, you're fine.
Share screen. All right, do you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
All right. Can you see the Peter Berryman's picture?
I see his picture and his grave.
Awesome. So if I switch it, do you see the map?
No.
Oh, it's not letting me switch it then. I'm not sure why.
Why don't you keep it on this page?
Okay.
And then just click on the slides and you'll be fine.
All right. I'm so sorry about that, everybody. Well, here's the map that I was talking about where you can see where his ancestry was from and some of the different points along the way, but the majority of his ancestors came from this Yorkshire area. So then I just started experimenting and just going really deep into some of his ancestors and found some pretty cool stuff. But then I started focusing on his children because all of them were born in Sangamon and Springfield. And so here is a list of his different children. And so I'm just going to go through these a little bit because some of them have some pretty cool stories. So first off, Thomas Berryman was his firstborn, and him, along with several of these other brothers, were big into the circus industry, which was very interesting. So he was born in Springfield in a log cabin on Vinegar Hill, actually, so on Capitol Avenue and College Street. But later he did go to Ohio, and he kind of traveled around a little bit. But he did graduate from Springfield Business College. He was, as I said, employed by Barnum and Bailey Circus as the treasurer, and he traveled all throughout the U.S. until he returned to Springfield and got married and worked in the brokerage and loan business. So that was some of the information I found about him, and I'm just going to go through some of these because I'm trying to get to some of the bigger names that some of the cool stories, I guess, that stuck out, I guess. But so then Mary J., she died as an infant, so there's not a ton of information on her, but she is buried here, I believe, in the Springfield Cemetery. So then John J. Berryman, he was actually the last survivor of this family. He was known as Judge when he was in Springfield. Since he apparently had that appearance, they called him that. So he was also in the circus business and traveled abroad a lot. The 1904 Springfield Directory actually just lists his occupation as traveling, which I thought was pretty cool. I wish that was just my job, just traveling. But his name did appear on several passenger lists that I found, including England, Cuba, and Australia. And so a lot of that was traveling with the circus, which is very cool. So I tried to find some stuff about his wife, and there's not a lot of information on her, unfortunately, but it does seem like that they didn't have any children. So then going to George Robert Berryman. So he was born in Springfield as well, but he was the only brother who was not really involved in the circus. He mainly stayed very much in Springfield and Sangamon, and he became one of Springfield's most prominent loan and real estate men for over 20 years. However, he died early at the age of 53, and according to a newspaper article I found, he had a carbuncle on his lip, which produced blood poisoning and led to a brief 1 week's illness before he passed away. His wife's name is Mary Wells, and I'm going to come back to her because she has so much information on her line and some of her ancestors and descendants and everything. It's just very, very cool. So I'm going to come back to George Roberts' wife in a second. So going to Peter or Benjamin, Ben, he was also a very much known as one of the circus people. So he was a barker with the Ringling Brothers, Barnum's Greatest Show, and Bailey Circus. So he did a lot of stuff in the circus industry. So he was known as Barnum's lightning ticket seller, and he was recognized as the fastest ticket seller in the world. And so there's a couple articles about him, which was kind of cool. And many people talked about how quick he was and how sharp his mind was, and how there are several stories like this one in particular. Barnum was showing at Bunker Hill, Massachusetts, and there's 3 performances given this day. And Ben sold 25,000 tickets and had no complaint of mistake in handling change or any of that. They said that he had a quick mind, of unusual strength, and basically they kind of attribute some of like how fast he worked and how crazy his life was for a little bit to later in his life, his mental health drastically just withered away. Basically, he started not being fully cognizant and everything like that, and so he was placed in the Bartonville Insane Asylum in Peoria. But they also have stories about him how he was just very, very sweet, and it's not like he was ever violent or anything like that. He just couldn't think very well or very clearly, and they really do attribute this to how overworked he was during the circus and his time there. But it was pretty cool to see that he was just known as like, you know, one of the lightning ticket seller, the fastest in the world. He did get married. He married a woman named Laura Bell Smith, but they were only married 9 years due to his early death after a long mental illness. But they did live with Peter Berryman on 9th Street, South 9th Street, for a large part of their marriage. And so that's just another connection to like the Abraham Lincoln's neighborhood. So finally, the last two were the daughters of Peter. And so Adeline Berryman McConnell lived in Springfield her entire life. She married William H. McConnell in 1880 and had a daughter, but she was mainly just a stay-at-home mom and homemaker. Her husband, William, was a well-known businessman of Springfield. He was an advertising manager at the Springfield Register. And William's father was named Andrew Brindley, and he was also a big, prominent Sangamon man. Andrew, and his father, so William's grandpa, came and brought a ton of sheep, apparently. And so they were taking up a wild tract of land in Sangamon, Christian, and Montgomery counties. Apparently they had 200 merino sheep and were considered the great wool growers of Illinois, some of the best. So Andrew Brindley also served as the chairman of the county board, and he was also a sheriff of Sangamon County at one point. So then going to Celia, she was born in Springfield, but she actually died in Iowa because she married a man named Henry Wright Shove Jr., and they had 4 children. According to a 1910 and 1920 U.S. censuses, Henry worked as a traveling salesman selling tea and coffee, but his 5th great-grandfather was Major Samuel Ells. And this is kind of a cool story. So Ells is believed to have been the bodyguard of the escaped regicides of Charles I of England. So Edward Raleigh and William Goff. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this story, but they took refuge in Connecticut, and Ells actually built a house to protect them. And so here is the house called the Ells Stowe House, where he harbored these regicides. And so this house is one of the oldest in Milford, Connecticut, and is now owned by the Milford Historical Society. And there's some really cool history and different stories that are involved in this house, one of which is Stowe. So Stephen Stowe, which is the other part of the name of this house. So Ells' grandson, so Major Samuel Ells, this is where it gets confusing. His grandson, Nathaniel, married Martha Stowe, and Martha's brother, Stephen Stowe, eventually bought the property and all of that, like tracking some of the purchasing and all of that. But Stephen Stowe is known as the Martyr of Milford and is actually considered a hero of the American Revolutionary War because a British ship, a British prison ship, abandoned 200 American soldiers / prisoners of war on the Milford Harbor. And so Stowe offered up his home, which was this house, to take care of them, even though many of them had smallpox. And so this is obviously a time where smallpox was very terrifying and they didn't know a lot about it. And so it was a big deal for him to offer up his house. And eventually he did die of smallpox and was buried along with many of the other soldiers in a common grave. And so they just recognize him as, like, you know, being willing to sacrifice his life to protect some of these American soldiers. So going back to Mary Wells's line, as I said, there's some really interesting things that went down all these rabbit holes trying to find things about her. So first I'm going to talk about these top 3. And so Mary Wells, her father, Frederick Thompson Wells, was a Union soldier during the Civil War. And so there's a little bit of information on him and how he was discharged honorably in Iowa. She's also featured, Mary is also featured in the Daughters of American Revolution lineage books because her great-grandfather, Joseph Wells, was a Revolutionary War patriot. And so there were just some cool things finding all these different patriots and soldiers in her line. But then I kept digging, and I'm so glad I did because there's a lot of other connections. So Mary's 4th great-grandfather, Ambrose Thompson, basically connects her to John Wilkes Booth. And so it's a little confusing. So I actually have just a screenshot of my ancestry page so you can see Ambrose Thompson and Mary Wells being traced to Ambrose. So this is her 4th great-grandfather, and Ambrose had 8 children, and so Mary's line stems from Ebenezer Thompson, but another one of Ambrose's sons, Ambrose Thompson Jr., married Mary Ann Booth. And so Mary Ann Booth, obviously that last name is infamous, at least when we're talking about Lincoln. And so this line can be traced all the way to the 1200s, which was really interesting. I went back to the Adam de Booths of Withensaw, which was a part of the aristocracy in England. And so like this last name was very cool. It went down so many different areas and everything like that. But one of the greatest things that I found, which is also obviously a sad thing, but cool finding, was that Mary Ann Booth shares a common ancestor to John Wilkes Booth. And so their common ancestor is right here at this top. This Booth of Dunham Massey is the full. So the name is Sir William Booth of Dunham Massey, and that is the common link to John Wilkes Booth. And so it was just really cool to say that I had John Wilkes Booth in my tree, this family tree that I'm researching. Obviously, it's very sad, but it was cool to like look into this and see this connection. So yeah, that was just one of the really cool findings that I had. And then moving on to some more about Mary Wells. So these second ones, these bottom 2 bullet points, Mary's 6th great-grandfather was Governor Thomas Wells. And so there's a lot of information on him as well. He was the only man in the colony of Connecticut's history to hold all 4 top offices. He was the governor, the deputy governor, treasurer, and secretary. He is everywhere in Connecticut's history. So I was looking into a ton of things about him. He is definitely credited as being kind of one of the founders of this state. And so there's a lot of stuff about him, like in their historical societies. And so he descended from a family of very high rank in Normandy in England, but he actually left England after being admonished by the Star Chamber Court for holding Puritan tenets and just values like that. And so he actually his property was confiscated, but he avoided further punishment by heading to New England. So he came over and basically was part of the group that started Connecticut. So going from him, then I found that Governor Thomas Wells' 4th great-grandson was Gideon Wells. And so here is just a lineage, a screenshot of this. So Gideon Wells, and as you can see all the way up here is Governor Thomas Wells, who again is connected to Mary Wells. So there's a lot of different avenues going down through here, but Gideon Wells is awesome. So he was a very cool find. Let me find where I had my information on him though. So he was Lincoln's naval secretary. He is credited with massively expanding the Navy and its size and capabilities. And so he started with only 76 ships at the beginning of the Civil War. And then at the end, he had 671 by the end of the war. So he basically made the U.S. Navy the largest in the world after the Civil War. He's also, he successfully executed the naval blockade of the southern ports, which a lot of people said helped strangle the Confederate war effort and was really a big milestone there. He's also credited with adopting one of the most important innovations in naval history, which is the ironclad warship. So he also created and drafted all these diaries while he was the naval secretary. And so that has been compiled into a book, which is described as one of the most important building blocks for understanding the Civil War. So there's a ton of information on him. He is everywhere. Like there's several pictures of him with Lincoln. So he is the one sitting right to the right of Lincoln with a very big white beard. That is Gideon. And this famous picture, which is the first reading of the Emancipation before Congress. So there's several different letters, and there's a huge archive at the Library of Congress with a bunch of his writings. And so it's just very cool to see that he was in this tree that I was exploring and everything like that. So that was some of the big finds, all these different people, especially Mary Wells's line. So, and he actually, relating to Professor Moseley's presentation, he actually had 2 Irish maids as well. And so I was able to find that, which was just very cool because I already knew what Professor Moseley was doing. So I was like, oh, there's a connection as well. But yeah, this has really been what I've been working on, and I'm sorry that my technology was a little rough at the beginning, but hopefully you guys were able to see some of the highlights. Thank you guys so much. My email is right here if you have any questions. Yeah, thank you guys.
All right. Thank you so much, Anna.
Yeah.
So we were able to discover quite a bit about the people we were researching. I kind of skimmed the top of it because a lot of these maids, it was really cool to find like the ships they were on. Because if you're on Ancestry or Threefold, or even just looking in some of like the early settlers, you get a feel of their sense of travel from one location to the next. And the connection that we have with not just the county and the state, but we have a connection to states out east and across the pond towards England, Ireland, Scotland, and Europe. So in going down family trees and connecting people via their occupation, you can discover what kind of life they led, and also see the connections to history itself, both locally and as a national collective. So now we'd like to open our time to any questions that that you may have for us. So if you have a question for Anna or myself, feel free to put them in the comments, and we can pull them up and try to answer them. As we have discussed, a lot of our research has been on Ancestry, but we've also spent a lot of time in the newspapers. It is so wonderful to have that at our disposal, because you can find so much. And back in the day when I was talking to other historians, they had to go to the library and go on to microfilm readers to look at newspapers. And they would talk about how much their eyes hurt by looking at all these reels. So we can count our lucky stars that UIS has subscriptions to newspaper databases, because that allows us to do some research from the comfort of our desk or at home.
For sure.
So, Anna, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
Since you're coming from a different perspective of this type of research, instead of looking at it as a historian, you're looking at it from all different angles. What resource did you find the most beneficial in looking at the family trees and finding those connections? That could be like census, newspapers, documents. Right. It could be databases.
I think the censuses were some of the ones that were really important to me, because I was looking often for their occupation, and normally those are listed there. And so that was cool for me to see some of the ones I saw. Some of them were connected to the circus, some of the children. Then I kept looking for other connections to the circus. And so a lot of the census and then like passenger lists were very interesting to see where they traveled, and, especially with the circus, like where they traveled when the circus went abroad or when it went to different states. So those were two of the biggest ones, I guess, the censuses and the passenger lists. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I like passenger lists a lot, mostly because then you get a chance to see them write their own name.
Yeah.
A lot of times we like to look at occupations, families, where they came from, but to see them actually write their own name, I don't know, it forms more of a connection with the person. Because most people don't realize that when you go to passenger lists, and it's misspelled, or we like to blame the person taking notes, but majority of the time it's the person traveling signing their name on the passenger lists instead of a clerk. So
that is cool. Yeah.
Well, Anna, thank you so much for joining us. It looks like we don't really have any questions. If you do think of one down the road, feel free to email us at sangamonexperience@uis.edu. And we will get your question to Anna if it's directed to her. Or here at the Sangamon Experience, we're always doing research on the people who lived here. My topic dealt with Lincoln and the people connected to him. Anna is about his neighbors and their lineage. But when you really look at it, there are a lot more connections than we realize that are right outside our back door. And in Benjamin's case, his front door. So if you are doing family research and you find those wonderful connections, feel free to share them with us because we are always looking for new and interesting stories of people who lived here in the Sangamon County area. So again, thank you, Anna, for joining us. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And we'll see you next time here at the Sangamon Experience. Thank you.